Welcome everyone. My name is Nancy Wallace-Lobbs and I am so excited that you're here. So if you're someone who is a landlord, wants to be a landlord, or has struggled with the tenant screening process, this video is for you. You know, I have been in property management for probably going on a couple decades now. I have managed over 1,000 doors and literally screened hundreds of tenants, if not thousands. I screened a lot of tenants in my careers in a property management. I also own my own rentals, so everything I'm going to teach you today is what I do on my own personal rentals. So I want to talk to you about getting the right tenant for your property. Now, if you have single family, multifamily, this video is for you. If you have a property that you bought right, hopefully right, you're going to have it as a rental, then you want to make sure that you have the best candidate in that property, the best tenant. Why? That's what's going to make you a profitable landlord. If you make an error in this one thing, this is the one thing that landlords tell me they struggle with, is getting the right tenant the first time. You don't want somebody to move in and then 3 or 4 months later they move out, they don't pay the rent. You get what I'm saying here. Now, do things happen? Yes, they do. But in some of my next videos, we're going to talk about lease agreements and things like that. But for today, we're strictly going to focus on how to screen applicants for you to get the very best tenant. So the first thing we're going to start with is a completed application. Now, I am a real estate broker here in Texas. So our application is 4 pages long. So that application is just chock full of information that, as a property owner looking for a good tenant, gives me a great starting place. It's going to tell me when do they want to move in. It's going to tell me how many people are going to be living in the house. It tells me what they're stating their income. It tells me about their pets. It tells me a lot of good information that I can start the screening process. Now, before you start the screening process, here are some things that you want to look at before you move ahead. So number one, check the property address where they're applying for. Believe it or not, if you own more than one, and this has happened, especially if you're managing properties, we'll get applications in and they'll leave that part out. It's literally the first line. What property you're applying for, and you want to make sure it's your property. You don't want to waste your time with someone who's not applying for your property. They really meant for another property. So believe it or not, that happens quite frequently. And then you want to check the move-in date. If your property is ready to go today, you're not looking for someone who can't move for 60 days because they have to give notice. So you want to check what move-in date they're looking for. Check for the number of people applying for the property. So on the very first page of the application, it will list who's applying for the property and all the family members. And then you can find out how many applications you're going to need to run. So if it's a couple or 2 adults, you're going to need to run background checks for both individuals. Check emergency contact is different than applicant. You'll find a great case study I have on this very thing. A lot of times when applicants fill out that sheet, they will just list their spouse or partner as the emergency contact, but you actually want someone who's not going to be living in the property and someone that you can contact in case of an emergency. And then scan the income information to make sure they qualify. What I mean by that is kind of quickly look down how much money they're making. So if they're only making $200 a month and you have a $1,500 a month property, obviously they're not going to qualify for income. So you're doing this kind of pre-search, pre-scan, if you will, of the application to, number one, save you time and not waste your time going through the application process, the screening process for someone who's not going to qualify. And number two, you're actually doing the applicant a favor because you certainly don't want to charge them an application fee if they're not even going to qualify based on what you're seeing on the application. Look at the questionnaire on page 2 or 3, I forget which one it is. There is a questionnaire that talks about, have you had any bankruptcies? Have you ever had any evictions? And this is key because when you do move forward with screening, if that information comes up, then the applicant disclosed it. I have had occasions where applicants don't disclose that they were evicted, but if you do the background check right, you're going to find out about that. And then look at the type of pet listed. So on almost 99.9% of our properties, we are pet friendly, and we encourage people that have pets. Now, a little caveat here, not talking about emotional support animals. That's a completely different video that we'll do on another day. Today I'm talking about actual pets that people are bringing, and what you'll want to check here is the type of pet, because in our criteria we say, well, if you have an aggressive breed, those breeds that have been deemed aggressive, such as German Shepherds, Rottweilers, Pit Bulls, it's not that we don't love those pets, but what sometimes happens is that the insurance carrier can cancel an owner's property based on that type of animal, or maybe the tenant is going to have to buy some additional insurance. So then as you as a property manager have to figure out how are they going to keep that in place. Now, I talk a lot about the tenant selection criteria. And what this is it's actually a document, a form that goes along with our application. And what we want to do is let the applicant know, hey, we're going to do a background check, and you have to go through a process with this. And these are the things that we're checking for. So number one, we have to make sure that they have the ability to pay. Well, that has to do with your income. So like I said, we look at 3 times the amount of rent. So if your rent is $1,500 a month, then that applicant's family, the gross family income, needs to be a minimum of $4,500. If it's anything less than that, number one, that's our criteria. So we implement that across the board, and that's very important. So you can't say, okay, well, you can do just 2 times and you can do 1 time. What if they can pay for a whole year's rent? So what I say is stick to your process and make sure you're following it every time with each and every applicant. Number 2, rental history. So rental history and ability to pay, in my opinion, are the 2 biggest factors of whether you're going to have a successful relationship with a tenant who continues to pay. So rental history is key. And what we do look at is evictions and past judgments from other landlords. Oh, look, I spelled evictions wrong. Eviction us. And past judgments from other landlords, because unless they've made good on the judgment or eviction with the prior landlord, you'll want to make sure that the tenant is going to pay rent, right? So we typically do not allow people that have evictions. Now, depending on circumstances, situations, length of time, and the willingness to pay a higher security deposit, we may consider them. But if they just got evicted 6 months ago and they were paying the same, we look at, were they paying the same amount of rent? This kind of goes for foreclosures too. If somebody had a mortgage for $1,500 and they were not able to sustain the $1,500 a month payment for mortgage, more than likely they're not going to be able to sustain your monthly rent of $1,500. Now again, things can change and whatnot, and there's a little wiggle room, but that is one thing you'll want to take care of. And if they do have past judgments and they had an eviction, if they do not owe the current owner and they made payments or paid off the other landlord, then, and they showed good faith that way, then we'll consider them. But they have to have everything else. They have to have the income and a good rental history prior to the eviction. And then the credit history, it has to be based on ability to pay. I get this question all the time. Well, what's that credit score number that you want? Well, I don't have a credit score number, because what I have found is just because you have a high credit score doesn't necessarily mean you're going to make a good tenant, right? Some of my best tenants have had the worst credit, and we're going to go over credit and how to kind of read a credit report here in a minute. And then pets. I want to make sure that they don't have the restrictive breeds for our company. And remember, I'm doing this across the board for all of the people who are applying for our properties. So our insurance carrier does not allow German Shepherds, Pit Bulls, and that kind of thing. So unless there's a change in our insurance agent acceptance of that, then we will not accept that. Now, the reason I go over this first is this form, the tenant selection criteria form, is we have our applicants sign that. So when they give us an application, before we even start the process, we have them sign our tenant selection criteria form so that they are informed of what we're going to be checking on, because anything in there they could get denied. So we want them to be aware that, hey, we're going to, check out your pets, and hey, we're going to check out your credit, and hey, we're going to check out your rental history, and we're going to verify your income. Now, other documentation, so once you've gotten past that point, you see, well, okay, I'm going to go ahead and start moving forward with this. So some of the other documentation that you want to collect before screening is, number one, have a signed application. You would be amazed at how many people turn in an application and it's not signed. Now, in our policy and the application, when they sign it, that gives you permission to pull their credit. It gives you permission to run a criminal history. Without that permission, you shouldn't be doing that. So they have to give you permission, and it's kind of like when you go, get a loan or something. The loan organization, the lender has to get your permission to run your credit. Same thing when you're doing background screening, so make sure of that. Also, for us, we do a signed tenant selection criteria. So this is, again, informing the applicant, hey, we're going to be checking your credit, your criminal history, your rental history. And in that document, it also says anything that we find that is different from on the application, or if they left out stuff, is grounds for us to not approve them for the property, and they would be denied. We do get an application fee for each person that's applying for the property, 18 and older. They each go through a background check. Now, even if they're in high school, we still have to, because it's our policy, 18 and over. So we still run a background check. Granted, they're probably not going to have a lot of credit or anything, but we have to keep in compliance with our procedures and treat everybody the same. Now, I put a copy of picture of ID and social security number because I actually was giving a speech one time about how to do all of this, and somebody said, well, what if they don't have a social security number? Well, you cannot run a background check if you don't have a social security number. So if somebody's coming from another country, or or maybe they're coming here for a job, and let's say they're coming from Germany or France or Europe or whatever, then they can have a guarantor, but without the social security number, you're not going to be able to pull credit. You just can't. So then you can put some other things in place, like you can charge a higher security deposit. So we require that. We require a social security number. Proof of income, which I'm going to get to in a minute, what types of things you can get from an applicant to help you with their income. And then we like a color picture of the pet with the applicant in the picture. Now, this is not required at the time of screening. We do get it before we actually lease to the applicant. But the reason we like this, and people love this, because people who love their pets, they're part of their family. I've never had anybody turn me down to say, hey, why don't you give us a color picture of you? And this tells us, like, if they put down that they had a little poodle on their application, and it turns out that the poodle is actually a German Shepherd or a 500-pound poodle, then that helps us with the right deposit, the pet deposit for that applicant. Now, you have to verify the following. So now you've gotten the application, you've done your scanning, you're kind of the pre-screening, and you're wanting to move forward with actually doing the full-on background check for your applicant. Now, up to this point, you haven't done that. All you've done is collected info. You've scanned the application, you've verified move-in, you've verified how many people are going to be occupying the property, and you've looked at their income and their pets. So now we're actually going to start the verification process. So now they've paid their application fee, they've signed the application, the tenant selection, and you're ready to rock and roll. So what we verify is income, prior rental history, background criminal check, and the credit history. Now we're going to go through step by step how we're going to do each of that. So first off, on the income. So now people might say, well, why don't you call the work number, or why don't you accept employer letters? All of that can be forged. Now, it doesn't mean that pay stubs, I've seen this now, pay stubs can be forged. So we're looking for pay stubs that the applicant gives to us, right? And there's a number of ways to verify whether or not the applicant actually works there. I mean, if you call an employer these days, They might say, yes, they work there. They might tell you that, they make X dollars or whatever. You might get a letter. I mean, I've actually had people give me letters on a company letterhead only to find out that it was false, that they had basically just made up the letter. So you do have to be careful of how you're screening and getting the right information. And when we get back to the credit report, we're going to see how all of these things tied in. So this is where you're going to start. So you're going to get, for W-2 employees, I get the last 3 to 4 pay stubs. And what I'm looking for here is a couple things. Number one, remember we talked about rental history, and there's some kind of cross-reference when you take all this information in. So I am looking at what they're making, but I'm also, a lot of times pay stubs have year-to-date earnings. They'll have the person's address, so you can verify that, and it kind of gives you an idea if they're full-time or part-time. Now, for self-employed people, love you, but you just don't have any pay stubs, right? I'm self-employed, so I can totally relate to this. So what I'm going to ask you for is 4 months of bank statements. And I don't want to just see the front page. I want to see all the pages of not only your personal bank statement, but also your business. Now, why would I do this? Well, my job when I am getting, and you as a landlord or a property manager, your job is to make sure you get the very best qualified applicant to do what? Pay rent. So you've got to verify their income. And if you have questions or you can't figure out what they gave you, just go back to them. Now, sometimes people do want to push back on the bank statements, and I let them know, and I do this. When I get their bank statements, as soon as I've verified the information, then they're shredded, they're not kept in their file. What I'm looking for here is the money. A lot of times people pay their rent out of their checking account. So I want to look for rent. I want to look for other expenses that might impact their ability to pay. So I don't take tax returns, and I'll tell you why. I don't take tax returns because they're kind of complicated, right? But I want to know that they have the ability to pay today, not last year. I need to know that they have the ability to pay today. What is their current income? So if somebody's, let's say, not working, maybe they have a bunch of money in their savings account, and they have a good rental history. So sometimes it doesn't come down to, do you have a job? Are you self-employed? What is the means that you are going to use to pay your rent? Now, we talked about the verification, but I also want to show you how to calculate yearly income so you can come up with a monthly number. Because sometimes when you're paid biweekly, you get 26 pay stubs, and how do you calculate that? So if you know what their hourly rate is, you can literally take that hourly rate times 2080. That's the number of hours a full-time person works, technically, right? And you just multiply it. If they're part-time, you take that same hourly rate times 1,040. And when you get that number, you simply divide it by 12, and that gives you their monthly income. The other thing is, if they're paid bi-weekly, you'll want to take that gross amount on their pay stub and times it by 26, because bi-weekly payments are every 2 weeks. So in a year, they would get about 26 payments, and then divide that number by 12, right? And that gives you the monthly income. So then you can start calculating whether or not they have enough money to meet your 3 times amount of rent. Now, let's move on to rental history. So first I look at ability to pay, and then for me, the most important is rental history, or the second most. I want to verify that they do actually have the funds to pay and the ability to pay. Now I need to make sure they have the history that they have been paying their rent. So I will look at applications for consistency. So here's what I do. So the person has to provide a picture ID. Typically that's a driver's license. So here in Texas, we have a little rule that says if you move here, you got to change your address within 10 days, something like that. I moved here, I'm sure I went over the 10 days. So, but if it's been 5 years, I'm going to say, well, and you still have an out-of-state address, okay, so that's one. Number two, remember I said that sometimes their address is on the pay stub, so you can look at what they put down as their current address on the application, compare it to what's on the driver's license, and compare it with what is on their pay stub. And this is a really good clue to the rental history, because if it's consistent throughout, okay, they're probably giving you the skinny. But if it changes from all of those three things, you need to kind of dig into why. Why did they change? Why are they not consistent? Because as you're verifying this information, you could call the landlord, but let me give you a scenario. So if you're a landlord and you have a really bad tenant, you just want to get rid of them, and I call you up and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Landlord, I'm calling about Sally Smith. She's applying for one of my properties. What are you going to tell me? Because you want Sally out of your property, right? So I typically do not call owners of a property unless I know them and I know that they're going to be honest with me. But typically, most landlords are not going to give you the skinny on a bad tenant, right? Especially if they're trying to get them out. So if the tenant has already moved on and no longer live in their property, then you would get the skinny. But if they're coming from that owner's property to your property, their goal is to get them out. Your goal is to find a good tenant. And so it's probably not going to be the same agenda. You know what I'm saying? Now, when you do have single owner's name, and this actually has happened to me on multiple occasions. So if you're brand new to this, or you keep getting applicants that you're not really sure about, so a really good tip is if they lived in if they put down, Joe Smith was their landlord, then go to the county tax rolls for your area and look up who owns that property. And I can tell you this is why I don't call landlords either, is because a lot of times the person that they put down is not even the owner of the property. Now, if they came from an apartment or a property management company that's reputable, then yes, I'll call them. Typically, they're not going to give you the info over the phone. There's a form you send in and say, hey, I need to check, were they late? Did they pay on time? And one good question, whether you talk to landlords on the phone or not, a great question to ask the previous landlord is, would you rent to this person again? Because that pretty much tells you it all, right? If they say no, okay, you might want to think about taking a hard pass. If they do tell you no, then try to find out why they wouldn't. And if it's maybe they had, I don't know, too many dogs or too many cats, or maybe they were just not a good tenant and they tore up the property. So that is an excellent question to ask any previous owner. Would you rent to this person again? Now, let's talk a little bit about pet policies and restrictions. So like I said, almost all my personal rentals are pet friendly. The majority, I would say, like I said, 99% of all of our owners under property management were pretty much pet friendly. Now, if you don't know if you should be pet friendly or not, let me give you a little clue. Most tenants out there, most applicants are going to have pets. Dogs, cats, I kind of draw the line at snakes and fish. Sorry for those people that, have those. The fish thing is just, if they have a little fish, okay, that's, not really a pet. It's just a little fish. But I'm talking about those big aquariums, because we actually had a tenant that had one of those and it broke and caused a lot of damage. So, we were able to have the tenant take care of that. But those big 50-gallon aquariums can cause a lot of damage. So, you have to think about your insurance considerations, the breeds that I talked about being aggressive. Using the tenant selection criteria form can save you so much time in this regards, because you can actually have a conversation with your applicant about, well, I see that you put down, 3 German Shepherds or whatever. And, it's completely fine to ask for shot records. Let's say you get that picture like I was talking about. So my daughter has a dog that it looks like a pit bull, but she is the sweetest thing, but she's not really a pit bull. So I would request from her, if she was renting from me, a letter from her veterinarian telling me what kind of dog that was, right? Not because I don't like pit bulls, but because for my insurance, if my insurance agent were to drive by the property and he sees that particular dog, calls me up, cancels my policy, then I can say, hey, that is not a pit bull. And true story, we actually had one of our owners policy canceled because the inspector, whatever they call those guys that drive around the neighborhood making sure you're doing your thing, the tenant actually had a golden retriever, and the insurance guy, and the insurance actually got canceled. They sent us a letter saying, hey, we canceled it because you have a German Shepherd in the backyard. and it was not a German Shepherd. So we were able to provide the documentation because we had the color picture. We had, we told the tenant to give us a letter from their veterinarian, which we did, sent it right over, they reinstated it, no issue. So, it's good to just have that information. Pet deposits. So I believe in a couple different ways to do pet deposits. So number one, if somebody has a dog, cat, or whatever, and it's 35 pounds or less, then our pet deposit is $350, and I think it's like $150 is non-refundable. So we use a pet agreement with the lease agreement, and it states, okay, this amount is non-refundable, this part is refundable. We write that into the lease agreement. It's called the pet addendum. And we also write in, this is mostly for, our dog lovers out there, but, puppies can do a lot of damage to the yard, like digging up the sod, digging under the fence, chewing on the wood. So we write that as a kind of a special provision, if you will, into the pet addendum. And we just say that the number one here, this tenant responsible for disposing of all waste in and around the property. When we do a move out inspection, if we see dog waste out in the yard, we take a picture of it and we have a fee for that. So we send it right to the tenant, and it will come off of their security deposit if they, don't get over there and clean it up. So, and that's something we tell them in their tenant orientation. Hey, don't forget to pick up, what. Now, running credit checks. So here you can get into a lot of hot water if you don't do it correctly. So people ask me what I use, and I use National Tenant Network. There are a ton of companies out there. I don't get paid for saying that. I'm just telling you that's the one that I use because they do not only a criminal background check, the credit history, they do a social security trace, and I can pretty much find out, I can pretty much verify everything, the income, the rental history, just from their report. And I love it because they have one page and it has like, red, green, and yellow, which means, green means yay, go, yellow means caution if you're going to take this person, and red means hard no, hard pass. So always use a third-party verification to do your screening. Don't accept credit reports. Don't share credit reports. Like once you get the credit report, you cannot share that. You can sit down with somebody in the office, but it needs to be shredded once you've gotten your information. Remember, the number is not the most important information on a credit report, because having a score of 800 versus 500 doesn't necessarily make you a better qualified tenant. You have to kind of dig down to what is in the credit report, what they've paid, the bills that they paid, collections they may or may not have. So you've got to dig down and go beyond the number, I like to say. And then look for those items that impact the ability to pay, such as garnishments for child support, judgments, utility bills. And as of this recording, student loans can't be garnished right now, but if somebody, and we've actually had people that had hundreds of thousands of debt of student loan, and had they been garnished, they wouldn't be able to afford the rent. So even though it's, it's not one of those things that you can garnish if it's in collections, just be wary about what is going to impact their monthly income and ability to pay. And collections, are there collections for utilities? One rule that we use, and it seemed to kind of pan out, if someone lost their car, okay, so if you don't pay your car, they're going to come and repossess it. So if you had a repossession on your credit report, so think about that. If you don't have a car, now of course we're all working at home right now, so I guess it wouldn't matter. But we used to look at if you had a car repossessed, you weren't paying your utilities, maybe you're still paying your rent, but if you can't get to work, then you can't pay your rent. But I guess right now that wouldn't matter because pretty much everybody's working from home, right? Credit cards, medical bills. Now, let me say something about medical bills. If we see a lot of collections for medical bills, we just disregard it. Because, that could happen to anybody. If any of you had surgery or had to go to the doctor, it takes them months sometimes to get the billing out to you. And half the time you have to fight with the insurance company or fight with them, or, so we just disregard that, because that one thing could happen to any one of us. We could all have good credit, but have medical bills. Now, what about criminal history? So here you do have to be a little careful because there's some discrimination. You don't want to be accused of discrimination or whatnot. So what we do with criminal history is it's more information, right? So remember in the very beginning, I talked about the tenant selection criteria form, and we tell everybody, hey, we're going to do a criminal background check. So in all the years I've been doing property management, which is going on over 20, I have yet to have anybody that was a murderer, that, you know, just was really, really bad guy or gal that you would not want in any of your properties. And I think I kind of look at that as because of the tenant selection criteria, because we're saying, hey, this might be something that you would be denied for. Again, use third-party verification, and then check your local laws. So in some areas, if somebody's a sex offender, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily mean you couldn't rent to them, but is it next to a school? So, you know, those are the kinds of things that you need to know about. And then have some considerations of what the nature of offense is. So when we do criminal, I mean, DUIs will come up from 20 years ago. You know, maybe it was a domestic violence thing that happened, you know, 30 years ago, or however long it was. So look at the nature of the offense, how much time has gone by. Again, use your tenant selection criteria, and then validate the person with the offense. So the reason I say this last one is that we get the criminal background for sex offenders. The way that the search comes up is it's by the last four of the Social Security, and you don't have pictures of the person up there and everything. So we had an instance where somebody was applying, came back that they were a sex offender, literally had the same date of birth and last four of the social, but completely different picture, right? So we searched a little bit more and found out it was just like a huge coincidence that these two people, so it wasn't our applicant that was the sex offender. So you do want to validate the information, especially depending on what third party you're using, to make sure it's accurate, because what you don't want to do is deny someone housing. They've met every single requirement of the income and all of that, good rental history, only to deny them on something that might not be real. So have a discussion. The other thing I would say here is look on their application. Did they disclose anything? And the discussion that you would have with somebody like this is you say, hey, you know, let's just pick on Sally again. Hey, Sally, you know, I ran your background check. Everything checked out except this one thing. Can you explain it to me? Can you, and have a discussion. You know, it's totally fine to have a discussion to qualify whatever it is that you're trying to verify. Because remember, you're making a decision based on the information pulled by the third party. Now, I'm going to go over some case studies with you where some of these things like, whoa. So my first case study has to do with pet restrictions. So in the lease agreement, there's a section that says, hey, okay, you have no pets, you're not bringing any pets, but if you bring in an unauthorized pet, here's what's going to happen. The fine was, oh, I'm sorry, wrong case study. I looked sideways here. Okay, so we had that one owner that he didn't want, he was okay with dogs, he didn't want any cats. So it was really hard to advertise it, because you basically had to say case by case, you know, that the owner, you know, it was case by case whether they took those pets. So when someone would apply or call us and say, hey, do you get cats? No. Well, so this one lady actually called us about this house, and she just loved the neighborhood, the price range and everything. But guess what? She had 4 cats. So I said, well, the owner doesn't take cats. You know, he really doesn't want them. And so she offered up to pay a $500 per cat non-refundable deposit. So $2,000 on top of the normal pet deposit. And so the owner changed his mind, because he, you know, he said, okay, I'll take it for $2,000. That tenant lived in the property for 2 years, and when she moved out, there was absolutely no damage from the cat. No smell, no, you know, you hear some horror stories about what cats can do to properties. So, you know, you never know. So people love their animals, and a lot of times they treat them better than their children, right? But they become part of your family. And she was just happy as can be that she actually was able to have her 4 cats with her. Now, criminal history. So this was a very interesting one. And this is really the worst background criminal that I ever got in all of my time as a property manager. So the applicant was very upfront. He literally put it on his application that he had been in 10 years, he'd been incarcerated for drug trafficking, selling drugs, you know, 10 years. So it must have been kind of serious. He disclosed it, and we scanned his application, and everything else, he met the qualifications. So I called the owner and said, hey, we have this person that wants to apply for your property. Here's his background. What do you think? And so the owner decided to give this guy a second chance because he'd actually had some rental history since he had gotten out of prison. So it wasn't like he just got out of prison and then, came to this owner. So the owner decided to give him a second chance. This tenant was in the property for almost 10 years. He turned out to be, his name was Al. He was wonderful. He was one of the best tenants we ever had. Unfortunately, he passed away before he reached his 10 years. And what he had done is he had turned himself into a cake baker. And he used to bring cakes to our office all the time. We loved Al. So that's just a really good story about, what? So he did have a criminal history where we might have just said, no, we're not going to rent to you because of this. But, he got a chance and he ended up being just a super good tenant. So friendly and, paid his rent on time. So here's a case study I wanted to go over. So I get this all the time. Well, what about the credit score? What about rental history? So this was actually from my very first rental property, and the challenge that I didn't know how to screen tenants. I didn't know what to look for. So I had a great mentor and I said, okay, I have these two people that are applying. So applicant 2 looks pretty good. She's got 780 credit score. If you just looked at that, applicant 1 had 530. Applicant 1 actually worked as a janitor, and I think his wife was a maid over at South Fork. And, they barely met the income qualification. I mean, but they had 8 years in an apartment that they got a glowing rental, never late, took care of the property or whatever. So the applicant number 2 was actually somebody that I knew. She was in my industry. She literally had just gotten a divorce. Her income was sporadic. Nice person. But I went to my mentor and said, look, I have these 2 people. I'm not really sure who to rent to because, at times she makes more money, but he barely. So my mentor said, go with applicant 1. He was in my property for 11 years. We literally got to know him and his family. He raised his 3 children. She ended up doing good. She ended up buying a house and, moving on. So it was all good for everybody. But if you just looked at these 2 people, you might say, well, they have a better credit score, but he actually was more reliable. Because one of the things I look for when I'm screening applicants is longevity. As a landlord, I like to have long-term tenants. That keeps the churn down. It keeps the expenses down on my properties. So that's why I like to have long-time tenants. So remember, this is a business. And here's what I've learned. Be professional at all times. You cannot be people's friends in this business. I mean, you can be courteous, professional, but it's kind of like that old saying, give an inch, take a mile. You have to follow your processes, keep it in writing. Have the written procedures, whether a single owner or you have multiple properties, follow your own guidelines, and don't deviate from applicant to applicant. Don't apply these guidelines here and this guideline here. Make sure that you are, treating everybody the same, and then you won't get accused of discrimination. Well, you might get accused of it, but you can show that you have a process. And as long as you follow that process with every single person, you'll be fine. Use an application that captures the information to make a business decision, right? Don't do handshakes. Don't say, oh, hey, I saw that you had a property or you want to rent to your cousin. No, you need to do your background checks because some of the posts I see on Facebook have to do with people rented to family members and they didn't follow their own guidelines, right? And then they say, well, now I can't get Aunt Sarah out or, cousin Jimmy, that kind of thing. So make sure that you are following your guidelines all the time. And then use the tenant selection criteria form to inform applicants what you will be checking. This is just such a good way to run your business because number one, you have the application, they signed it, they've given you permission, and now you're saying, hey, this is all the things I'm going to be checking, and so that they know their credit is going to be pulled, that you're going to be checking to make sure they're qualified applicants to turn into a tenant, and they sign that. So they're giving you permission, they're acknowledging that. And then you know what? Don't take an application fee for more than one person. Now, here's what I'm saying about this. I'm not talking about like if you have 3 adults that are applying for one property all together, yes, you're going to charge each of those. I'm saying, like, let's say you get 10 applications. Don't charge all those people an application fee. Look at the ones that you're going to move forward with and just work that application, 2 at the most, right? Now, because sometimes people get upset when they don't get the property. And when you have to deny someone, I don't really see too many people talking about this. So number 1, protect yourself by following your own written procedures, right? Do not deviate from that. I talk a lot about, I have a little date stamp I use, and I date stamp when I'm getting someone's, when they provide their bank statements, when they provide their pay stubs, when they provide their color picture. Because if I do have multiple people applying for the property, obviously my goal is to get someone that's qualified into that property as soon as possible. So if 3 people are applying and the third person, maybe they're not first to get their application in, but they were the first to get everything else in, so I could proceed. I've literally had people get their application in, get everything in, and not pay the application fee. So you have to be clear, and you also have to document everything. Have a timely follow-up with the denial letter. If you know right away that they're not going to qualify, you need to let them know. And you need to let them know why, and you need to put it in writing. One thing I like about National Tenant Network, and I'm sure other ones do this too, is that if I have to deny somebody, they just print off the letter, and then it tells them where they can call. Like if something's reported incorrectly off of their credit report, that's not my fault or my job to change it. So they actually have to go to the credit bureau to get that changed. So it gives them the number to call to take care of anything that is incorrect. Like I said, use a third-party verification system. And you know what? Sometimes, just to avoid the headache, just refund them the application fee. If you are a landlord or property manager, you're definitely not in the business of making money off of application fees. And, sometimes people just don't have a lot of money anyway. And so, you know what? And then they're quiet. They got their they didn't get the property, but it also, they might have to go and apply someplace else. So sometimes, yes, I'll just refund the application fee, just so, especially if they're making a stink about it. And it's like, well, this, you have, 7 evictions and, that kind of thing. Because I keep calling. And you know what I'm talking about as far as people really taking up your time that way. Well, I just want to thank everybody for watching today. I'm so excited that you're here. So first off, I'd like to ask, if you liked the information here, please share it to 5 of your friends that might, find this information helpful. Leave me a comment below. Love to hear what you think, feedback, that kind of thing. And then what are your thoughts about this process? What did you find in here that might help you save a little bit of time or help you when you're looking at all those applications? How can you make sure you're working with the best applicant? And then take this challenge. So the next time you have a vacancy, just use these steps that I've outlined to see if that streamlines your process. Remember, I always talk about those 4 questions. Ask them when they're moving in. Ask them what their gross family income is, the type of pets, and how old are they, and how many people are going to be occupying the property, right? And you can ask that before they even fill out an application. So I'm excited that you're here, and I can't wait to share my next video with you. So you're going to get another video from me in about 2 or 3 days. And what I'm going to talk about is what should be in your lease agreement. Thanks so much. Enjoy your day. Happy investing.